An open-air museum is a category of museum that exhibits collections of buildings and artifacts out of doors. European open-air museums are variously known as skansen, museums of buildings, and sometimes folk museums. A recent form is the Ecomuseum, which originated in France. A comprehensive history of the open-air museum as idea and institution can be found in Swedish museologist Sten Rentzhog's 2007 book Open Air Museums, The History and Future of a Visionary Idea. Living history museums, including living farm museums and living museums, are a type of open-air museum where costumed interpreters portray period life in an earlier era. The interpreters act as if they are really living in a different time and place, such as the colonial era, and perform everyday household tasks, crafts and occupations. The goal is to demonstrate older lifestyles and pursuits to modern audiences. Household tasks might include cooking on an open hearth, churning butter, spinning wool and weaving, and farming without modern equipment. Many living museums feature traditional craftsmen at work, such as a blacksmith, cooper, potter, miller, sawmill worker, printer, doctor and general storekeeper. Definition: open air is the unconfined atmosphere outside buildings. In the loosest sense, an open-air museum is any institution which includes one or more buildings in its collections, including farm museums, historic house museums, and archaeological open-air museums. Mostly the term open-air museum is applied to museums which specialize in the collection and re-erection of multiple old buildings at large outdoor sites, usually in settings of recreated landscapes of the past, and often include living history. Most of them may therefore justly be described as building museums. European open-air museums tended to be located originally in regions where wooden architecture prevailed, as wooden structures may be translocated without substantial loss of authenticity. Common to all open-air museums, including the earliest ones of the 19th century, is the teaching of the history of everyday living by people from all segments of society. Origins: a number of historically important buildings and the surroundings were opened to the public as museums as early as the first half of the 19th century, including the Palace of Versailles in France and George Washington's estate Mount Vernon in Virginia. However, the planned assembly of open-air museums was innovated in late 19th century Scandinavia. One reason may be the ancient tradition of moving and re-erecting wooden buildings based on the local log building technique. The idea was a predictable further development of the by then well-established indoor type of museum. In order to collect and display whole buildings, it would have to be done outdoors. Precursors of open-air museums were the exotic pavilions, antique temples, ancient ruins, and peasant cottages to be found in 18th-century landscape parks. Later precursors were the reconstructed peasant cottages shown at the international exhibitions of the mid to late 19th century. The world's first open-air museum was King Oscar II's collection near Oslo in Norway, opened in 1881. The original plans comprised 8 to 10 buildings intended to show the evolution of traditional Norwegian building types since the Middle Ages. Only 5 were realized before the king lost interest because of the expenses involved. The Royal Open Air Museum was later incorporated into the Norsk Folk Museum, established on an adjacent property in the 1890s. Influenced by a visit to the Norwegian Open Air Museum, Arthur Hazelius in 1891 founded the famous Skansen in Stockholm, which became the model for subsequent open-air museums in Northern and Eastern Europe, and eventually in other parts of the world. The name skansen has also been used as a noun to refer to other open-air museums and collections of historic structures, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. Around 1900, national and regional open-air museums were established in all Scandinavian countries, notably in Norway and Sweden. Most open-air museums concentrate on rural culture. However, since the opening of the first town museum, Den Gammelby, the Old Town in Aarhus, Denmark in 1914, town culture has also become a scope of open-air museums. In many cases, new town quarters are being constructed in existing rural culture museums. North American innovations. The North American Open Air Museum, more commonly called a Living History Museum, had a different, slightly later origin than the European, and the visitor experience is different. The first was Henry Ford's Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, where Ford intended his collection to be a pocket edition of America, but it was colonial Williamsburg which had a greater influence on museum development in North America. It influenced such projects through the continent as Mystic Seaport, Plymouth Plantation, and Fortress Louisburg. What tends to differentiate the North American from the European model is the approach to interpretation. In Europe, the tendency is to usually, but not always, focus on the building. In North America, many open-air museums include interpreters who dress in period costume and conduct period crafts and everyday work. The Living Museum is therefore viewed as an attempt to recreate to the fullest extent conditions of a culture, natural environment, a historical period. The objective is total immersion, using exhibits so that visitors can experience the specific culture, environment, a historical period using all the physical senses. Performance and historiographic practices at American living museums have been critiqued in the past several years by scholars in anthropology and theater for creating false senses of authenticity and accuracy, and for neglecting to bear witness to some of the darker aspects of the American past. Even before such critiques were published, sites such as Williamsburg and others had begun to add more interpretation of difficult history. List of open-air and living museums by country.